Colorado Territory, July 1873. The train thundered through the mountains like it was running from a secret, and Naomi Norwood clutched her carpetbag tighter as the world she left behind faded into soot and steam. Her gloves were stained, her boots scuffed nothing like the silks and polished leather she had grown up with. But the corset still hugged her ribs too tight, a last reminder of the gilded cage she'd broken free from. She was not going back. The train hissed to a halt at the edge of a nowhere place called Silverpine, a mining town tucked between steep hills and thick pine. The buildings looked temporary wooden, leaning, like they were trying not to fall over, but they were real enough. Naomi stepped down from the train and into the hot grit of the street. No one paid her much mind. Just another woman with a bag and a look that said she was running from something. She walked until her feet ached, then found the only boarding house with a clean window and a sign that did not swing too wildly in the wind. Mrs. Lila Hargreaves, the widow who ran it, gave Naomi a long look. "You alone?" "Yes, ma'am. Got money." Naomi opened her bag just enough to show a few coins and a silver brooch. Mrs. Hargreaves nodded once. "Second floor. Room near the back. Supper's at 6. No trouble, no men, no lies." Naomi nodded, her throat dry. No trouble? She kept her name. She figured Norwood was common enough, and no one out here would know it meant anything. Not like back east, where her father had tried to marry her off to a banker twice her age. Not like New York, where her every move had been watched. Silverpine was loud with hammers and shouting. The mines had come alive after the last silver strike, and every man in town seemed covered in dust. Naomi kept her head down, walking the streets only when she had to. She found work at the bakery scrubbing pans, then sewing buttons at night for the dressmaker next door. She was careful, quiet. But the second weekend she saw him. He was leading a dun gray horse out of the general store, a sack of oats over one shoulder and a rifle slung across his back. He looked like he belonged to the land, sun-brown skin, dark blonde hair that curled at the collar, and eyes the color of riverstone. He moved like someone who did not have to prove a thing. "Morning, Rita," he said to the store owner, nodding. "Back from the high pasture already, Rhett? Storm's coming. Got to get the herd low before it tears through." Naomi froze where she stood. He turned his head slightly, and their eyes met for half a breath. He tipped his hat. "Ma'am." She nodded, heart thudding too fast. Then she turned and walked away like nothing had happened. But something had. Rhett Prescott lived just outside town. Folks said he had a small spread, a dozen cattle, and worked part-time hauling, or for the miners. They said he had not married and did not talk much. She saw him again 3 days later, this time in the alley behind the bakery, helping a boy who had scraped his knee. "You all right, Pete?" Rhett asked, lifting the child gently by the arms. Pete sniffled and nodded. "Mama's going to be mad. I will tell her you were helping Miss Carver stack kindling. That sounds like something a brave boy would do." The boy gave a shaky smile. Naomi stood by the barrels, a sack of flour balanced on her hip. "He is good with children," she said, surprising herself. Rhett looked over. "They do not lie. Adults do." Naomi studied him. "Is that why you avoid most adults?" He set the boy down and turned fully toward her. "Maybe. Or maybe I just prefer quiet." She smiled a little. "I do too." They did not say much more, but something shifted. He started showing up more often at the bakery, at the well, at the dressmaker's when her needle slipped, and she needed a strong pair of hands to carry a bolt of cloth. He never pried. Never asked where she came from. He just showed up. One evening, she found him sitting on the steps outside the boarding house, his hat in his hands. "You look like you lost something," she said, leaning against the rail. "I saw a man in town today," Rhett said, wearing a New York suit, asking about a girl with red hair and green eyes. Naomi's breath caught. She did not answer. "I did not tell him anything," Rhett said, "but I figured I should let you know." She sat down beside him. "Thank you." He waited. Then, after a long pause, he said, "You running from someone who hurt you?" "No," she said. "I am running from someone who wanted to own me." He nodded slowly, like that made perfect sense. "I will not ask more," he said. "But if you ever need a place to go, I have room." That night, she could not sleep. The next day, the man in the New York suit left town. Naomi felt like she could breathe again. She went to the edge of town near the ridge, where Rhett had once said his land began. She found him fixing a fence post, sleeves rolled up, sweat staining the back of his shirt. "Still offering that place?" she asked. He looked up at her. "Always." She helped him haul the last piece of wood. They did not talk much, but the silence between them felt easy now. When the work was done, he opened the gate and let her walk beside him. His cabin was small but warm, with a stone hearth and a table he had built himself. There was a rocking chair by the fire and a quilt that looked like someone's mama had stitched it long ago. "You live here alone?" she asked. "Used to be my father's. He passed 5 years ago. I stayed." Naomi touched the edge of the quilt. "It feels like home." Rhett stood by the doorway, watching her. "You can stay as long as you like." She nodded. "I would like that." He stepped closer. "Naomi, if you ever want to tell me the rest, I will listen." She met his eyes. "And if I do not, I will still be here." She smiled then, a real one, the first in weeks. "Then maybe I will stay more than a while." Outside, the sky turned gold behind the mountains. Naomi stood in the doorway, the wind brushing her hair back from her face, and felt something she had not felt in years. Safe. Wanted. And maybe, just maybe, home. Naomi woke to the hush of early light, the scent of pine smoke curling through Rhett's cabin. She lay still, listening to the quiet knock of wind on the shutters and the rhythmic clatter of kindling being arranged in the hearth. She hadn't meant to sleep there, not at first. But after the storm rolled in the night before and the trail back to town turned to mud, Rhett had laid a blanket on the floor for himself and told her to take the bed. She hadn't argued. Pulling her shawl close around her shoulders, Naomi stepped out into the main room. Rhett was crouched by the fire, coaxing it to life. His hair was still damp from the rain, and his hands worked with the kind of calm that came from knowing exactly what to do and when. "You always up this early?" she asked. He looked over his shoulder. "Cattle don't wait." She moved to the small table and poured water from a ceramic jug into the tin basin. "I could help today, if you tell me what needs doing." He straightened slowly. "You ever dry fence or stack hay?" "No, but I learned fast." He studied her, then nodded once. "There's a calf with a sore leg. Needs wrapping. And the loft's got feed sacks that need mending. I've sown worse things." "I believe that." They worked side by side through the morning. Naomi knelt in the straw, coaxing the calf still while Rhett cleaned the wound. The animal kicked once, but she didn't flinch. Rhett noticed. "You grew up around livestock?" "No, but I read a lot. Books have their uses, even if they don't smell like barns." He chuckled low in his throat, and she glanced up at him, surprised to see the corners of his eyes soften. He didn't laugh often, not loudly, but when he did, it felt like something rare. They moved onto the loft. Dust hung in the air like old memories, and Naomi sat cross-legged on the wooden floor, stitching the torn corners of the feed sacks while Rhett hauled straw bundles from one end to the other. "Folks in town think you're a quiet man," she said, not looking up from her stitching. "They think right. Is it because of something that happened?" He paused. "I trust Slow. That's all." She didn't press him further. Instead, she asked, "Do you ever get lonely out here?" He didn't answer right away. Then, "Not as much as I used to." Her fingers paused over the cloth. She looked at him then, really looked, and saw it in the way he held himself, a man who had lost more than he'd ever say out loud. That night, as dusk settled over the hills, they sat out on the porch. The sky bled orange and violet, and a pair of coyotes yipped in the distance. Naomi wrapped her arms around her knees. "I used to think quiet was something you earned," she said. "Like peace. Something you got after you did everything right. And now I think it's something you have to fight for. Like anything worth keeping." He didn't speak for a long while. When he did, his voice was low, like he wasn't quite sure he meant to say it out loud. "I buried my mother in the spring. She made this place what it is. My father built it, but she kept it living." Naomi watched the wind move through the grass. "She raised you here?" He nodded. "Taught me how to ride, mend a fence, plant winter squash. Said a man should know how to feed himself and others. She sounds like someone I would have liked." "She would have liked you." Their eyes met again, and for once, there wasn't any guardedness between them. Just the soft acknowledgement of something growing quietly between two people who hadn't come looking for it. "Would you want help planting next season?" she asked. His gaze didn't waver. "If you're still here." "I think I might be." The last light slipped behind the ridge, and the sky deepened into a soft, endless blue. Naomi leaned back against the porch rail, the wood warm from the sun, and felt something settle in her chest. Not the thrill of escape, not the relief of being safe, but something quieter, something steadier. She didn't need to run anymore. Not tonight. Not with Rhett beside her. He stood and offered his hand. She took it without hesitation, and they went inside together, the door closing behind them with a soft click that sounded, for the first time, like belonging. The creek behind Rhett's pasture ran clearer after the storm, its banks dark with wet earth and scattered pine needles. Naomi stood barefoot in the shallows, her hem pinned above her knees, and let the cold water ease the heat from her legs. She had spent the morning hauling wood from the edge of the tree line while Rhett repaired the roof of the chicken coop. Her palms were blistered, her shoulders aching, but something about the ache felt earned. Rhett's voice reached her from the slope above. "You planning on bathing the whole herd down there?" She turned, water dripping from her hands. "Only if they ask nicely." He climbed down the path, sleeves rolled to his elbows, a crooked twig between his fingers. Storm snapped the eaves clean through. Might need new shingles by first frost. Naomi stepped out of the creek and wrung the water from her skirt. "I can ask Mrs. Hargreaves if she knows anyone who trades in cedar. She keeps records on everything." Rhett nodded once, but his gaze lingered on her feet, still wet, toes pressed into the soft mud. "You always this at ease with being out of place?" She reached for her boots without answering. The question wasn't sharp, it was honest, and she owed him the same. "I was never at ease back home," she said quietly. "Not even when I should have been. Here, I don't know. I feel like I'm not pretending." He took that in without comment, then sat beside her in the grass. "Where I grew up," she said, after a pause. "They taught us to play piano, to pour tea without noise, to smile only when spoken to. But no one ever taught me how to split firewood or patch a saddlebag. You've learned fast." "I had to." Rhett leaned back on his hands. "I saw that man again. The one with the city clothes. He came through the telegraph office yesterday." Naomi's jaw tensed. "Did he ask about me?" "No, but he sent a wire to Denver. I couldn't see much, but your name was on it." She looked down at the creek, watching the current catch around a cluster of stones. "He's my father's solicitor. He's not going to stop." Rhett didn't move closer, didn't reach for her, he just sat still, waiting. "I left behind a life that was already decided for me before I could speak full sentences." Her voice was low, steady. "I was set to marry a man who bought racehorses for fun and kept a girl in Boston for when he got bored. You didn't want it. I didn't want any of it. Not the man. Not the corsets. Not the dinner tables where women weren't allowed to speak unless it was to flatter someone richer than them." Rhett's gaze didn't shift. "And now, I want to make my own life. Even if it's small. Even if it's just this creek and a cabin that leaks when it rains." He was quiet for a long moment. "You could have that here. No one's going to tell you how to live." Naomi met his eyes. "And you? What do you want?" He looked down at his hands, dirt beneath the nails, a thin scar across one knuckle. "I want someone who doesn't expect me to be someone I'm not. Someone who sees the way things are and stays anyway." A wind stirred through the trees. Naomi reached for her boots, slipping them on with slow precision. "I was thinking of moving the rest of my things here. If that's still all right." His answer was simple. "It is." Later, after supper, Naomi stepped out to collect the laundry from the line. Rhett was stacking kindling near the shed, and the last of the sun caught in the fine dust clinging to his shirt. She paused, holding a dry sheet against her chest. "You ever think of building onto the house?" she asked. Rhett looked up. "Why?" She shrugged, pretending to study the sky. "Just thinking the kitchen could use a window. Maybe a bit more space by the stove." He rested the hat on his knee. "You planning on cooking more? Then? If I'm going to live here, I ought to pull my weight." "You already do." Naomi folded the sheet. "Still, a window wouldn't hurt." He stood and came to where she was, the shadows long across the grass. "If you want a window, we'll put one in." She raised her chin. I reckon this place could use a second pair of hands. And maybe a voice that doesn't sound like mine all the time." She smiled, slow and sure. "Then I guess we better start drawing plans." He didn't touch her yet, but when he looked at her, it felt like the space between them had changed shape. Like they'd stepped quietly into something neither of them had quite named, but both understood. Naomi turned back to the house, the sheet folded neat in her arms. Behind her, Rhett followed, their steps falling into rhythm without effort. The night settled around them, and for the first time, it felt like they were walking towards something that belonged to both of them. A frost came early that year. Not hard enough to kill the last of the onions in the garden, but enough to silver the edges of the windows and hush the fields in the morning. Naomi woke before the sun and pulled on her wool dress by lantern light. She had mended it herself, the seams tight now where they'd once been soft with neglect. She moved quietly through the cabin, careful not to wake Rhett. He had come in late the night before from the upper ridge, where one of the steers had strayed too near the rocky shelf. His boots were still by the door, crusted with clay. She left them there. He'd cleaned them the way he always did, without complaint, without hurry. Outside, the sky was pale as skimmed milk. Naomi gathered eggs from the coop and chopped a split of salt pork for breakfast. The fire caught quick. By the time the first light hit the edge of the porch, Rhett was already behind her, silent as always until the coffee was poured. "You hear the coyotes last night?" he asked, settling into the bench by the fire. "No, just the wind. They were circling close. Might be a den near the east fence." Naomi slid the pan onto the stove. "Want me to walk out with you later?" "If you're willing." They ate without rush, the silence between them no longer heavy with things unsaid. Afterward, Naomi packed a biscuit and some dried apple slices in a cloth, and they set out east across the stubbled pasture where the grass had turned brittle and gold. Rhett led on foot, rifle slung across his back, and Naomi followed, her shawl wrapped tight. The air smelled of cold bark and distant smoke. At the fence line, he knelt near a set of tracks pressed deep into the dirt. Too big for Fox. Not fresh, though. Naomi crouched beside him. "You ever lose stock to them?" "Once. Winter before last. They took a lamb. Nothing since." She looked out across the ridge, where the trees thickened. "I can keep watch at dusk, if you show me how." He glanced at her, expression unreadable. "You sure?" "I'm not afraid." He stood slowly. "I know. They didn't find the den, but they walked the full perimeter anyway, checking for weak posts and loose wire." Naomi pointed to a sagging section near the brook. "That one's bowed. I'll fix it after dinner. Might need to saw new rails. I can hold them steady." By the time they circled back to the cabin, the sun had climbed high, and Naomi's braid was loose from the wind. Her cheeks were flushed, but her stride was steady. Rhett Bennett unlatched the gate, then paused. "You ever think about putting down roots here? Not just staying, but building something?" She looked at him then, mouth parted slightly, breath caught. "I don't mean to press," he added. "Just been on my mind." Naomi stepped through the gate, the hinge creaking behind her. "I've never had roots anywhere. But lately, I've been thinking I'd like to." He followed her to the porch. "I've got a parcel east of the creek no one's touched. Could clear it next spring." "For what?" Rhett hesitated. "A garden. Maybe a shed. Something new." Naomi leaned against the post, the sun casting dappled light through the pine above. "Or a second cabin." He looked up at her. "I steady. You'd want that." She nodded once. "I'd want to stay close, but have a space of my own." "That makes sense." She stepped down, closing the distance between them. "I used to think love meant giving everything up. But with you, it feels like I get to keep myself." Rhett reached for her hand, his fingers rough and warm around hers. "That's all I ever wanted. Someone who stands beside me, not behind." She didn't answer, just leaned forward and pressed her brow to his chest, the heartbeat beneath steady as the land. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her like she was both fragile and unshakable. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of wood smoke from the town below. Somewhere, a bell rang from the chapel. Naomi lifted her head. "Maybe we clear that parcel together come spring." Rhett tipped his forehead to hers. "We will." She held him tighter, and for the first time since boarding that westbound train, Naomi felt the future settle into place, not as something to fear, but something to build. One fence post, one quiet morning, one long look at a time. By late October, the hills held the color of old copper, and the air carried a sharpness that settled deep in the lungs. Naomi stood at the edge of the cleared parcel east of the creek, a measuring rope in her hand and a pencil behind her ear. Rhett was driving stakes into the soft earth, the sleeves of his undershirt rolled high, the back of his neck flushed from working under the low sun. "You sure this is square?" she asked, squinting along the line they'd marked. Rhett leaned on the mallet. "Let me guess you measured it twice and still don't trust it." "I've seen too many crooked doors to take chances." He smiled, but kept his eyes on the stakes. "It's square." Naomi moved to the next mark and pressed the heel of her boot into the dirt. "Then we'll put the foundation here. I want the front to face the creek." Rhett nodded. "You'll get the morning light through the window." They worked until the shadows lengthened and the wind turned damp. Naomi peeled off her gloves and flexed her fingers, stiff from the chill. Rhett wrapped the rope and hung it over his shoulder, then took her hand without asking. His thumb ran slow over the base of her palm. "You've built something steady here," he said. "Not just this place." "Me? 2. Naomi didn't answer right away. She looked out across the slope, where the trees had thinned just enough to see the cabin's roof line in the distance. Smoke curled from the chimney, faint and steady. Back east, I never believed I'd be seen for anything but the name I carried. Here, I've only ever been who I am. You were always that person, Rhett said. Just took getting away to let her breathe. Naomi leaned into him. The late light caught in the curls at her temple, and Rhett tucked a strand behind her ear with the rough pads of his fingers. She closed her eyes at the touch, soft and sure and full of knowing. They made their way back as the first stars came out. Inside, the fire was banked low, and the cabin smelled of the root stew Naomi had set on earlier. She ladled it out while Rhett shook off his coat and hung it near the hearth. They ate in quiet, save for the soft clink of spoons against tin. Afterward, Naomi pulled a leather-bound ledger from the shelf beside the stove, one she'd stitched herself from scrap parchment and old thread. She opened it to a fresh page and wrote a single line across the top. Plans for spring. Rhett watched her from the rocker, his hands resting on his knees. You think we'll have enough saved to hire help for the roof? Naomi dipped the pen in ink. If I finish those coats for Mrs. Ledbetter by next week, we'll be close. He rocked forward slightly. I can take on the lumber haul from the mine. They're behind on their last order. Naomi kept her eyes on the page. You always take the hardest jobs. I want to make this right. She set the pen down. It already is. Rhett crossed the room and knelt beside her chair. His hand settled on her knee, light but firm. I want to ask you something. Naomi met his gaze, steady and open. I know you didn't come here looking for a man, or a husband, or any of what folks expect, but I've spent every day since you stepped off that train wondering how I ever lived before you. Her breath caught, but she didn't pull away. He reached into his pocket and drew out a small circle wrapped in cloth. He unrolled it, revealing a band of carved wood, polished smooth. It's not gold, he said, but it's mine. From the tree behind my father's grave. I carved it myself. Naomi lifted it gently, running her thumb over the grain. You want to marry me? I want to build a life with you. The ring's just a way to mark it. She slipped the band onto her finger, where it fit snug and warm. Then it's marked, she said. Rhett exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing as he rested his forehead against her knee. Naomi leaned forward and cupped the side of his face, guiding him up until their lips met soft, certain, and full of the promise they'd already begun. They married 2 weeks later, under the bare limbs of the sycamore beside the creek. Mrs. Hargreaves brought a pie, and Pete from the bakery carried a bouquet of dried asters Naomi had once mended into his mother's apron. Rhett wore his best shirt, and Naomi wore a dress dyed with walnut husks, sewn with her own hands. There was no preacher, just the two of them, and a promise spoken quiet and clear. That winter, they finished the second cabin together. Naomi filled it with shelves of fabric and books, a work table by the window that caught the morning sun just as she'd wanted. Rhett built a bench for the porch and planted winter peas in the garden behind it. They shared meals between the two homes, sometimes sleeping in one, sometimes in the other, depending on the work and the weather. By the following spring, the parcel bloomed with wild onion and green shoots. The coyotes kept their distance, and the cattle came through the winter lean, but alive. Naomi's hands stayed calloused, her back strong. Rhett's eyes softened more each day, never losing their edge, but filling with the kind of quiet that comes only when a man has nothing left to prove. One evening, after planting their first row of corn, they sat on the porch of Naomi's cabin, watching the stars emerge one by one. You ever miss the city? Rhett asked. No, she said, resting her head on his shoulder. Not even a little. He kissed the top of her head, his arm wrapped around her waist. They stayed like that until the moon rose high, wrapped in the stillness they'd built together. No running, no pretending, just the life they'd carved from the hard edges of the world, side by side. And they never left it. They lived long, and well, and always together.